Welcome back to our final video. If any of the arguments about Paul confronting empire have any merit, we are still left with the question of why did he write Romans 13? The first 7 verses read, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no fear of the authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive its approval, for it is God's servant for your good. But if you do what is wrong, you should be afraid, for the authority does not bear the sword in vain. It is the servant of God, to execute wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore one must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also because of conscience. For the same reason you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honour to whom honour is due." As we noted at the beginning, for some scholars this is so blatant that talk of Paul subverting the empire is just wishful thinking. So I will now run through 5 possible solutions that have been offered by scholars over the years. The first is contextual. Paul wrote Romans some years before Nero's persecution. His main opposition has been from Jews, and if Acts is to be believed, it is his Roman citizenship that has saved him. He thinks time is short, so political struggles are a diversion. In contrast, the book of Revelation was written around the year 96, though it may incorporate earlier material. Nero has had Christians tortured and killed around 65, and Jerusalem has been razed to the ground in 70. Emperor Domitian has undertaken another persecution in the year 95. The beast has now been unmasked, and Christians are urged to have nothing to do with the state and its evil ways. Thus Paul, writing in the 50s, really did think that God was controlling the state and that submissive obedience was God's will for his people. Had he lived 20 years after, he would no doubt have written differently. Dunn is somewhat akin to this position when he says, "Here we must recall that his advocacy of political quietism was in the context of the political powerness of most members of the ancient state. In contrast, our modern democratic traditions make it possible for individuals to exercise some political power and to pass judgment on whether rulers are operating for the good of their citizens. So essentially, don't judge Paul by a modern Western democratic free speech society. There was no chance of changing the state. One had to do one's best to work within it. As with all biblical interpretation, that doesn't mean that we should go along with this now, that we can have a voice in how the country is run." Second, relinquishing violence. Borg and Crossan point out that Romans 13 is a continuation of Romans 12, where we read in verse 19, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." In their view, quote, Paul is most afraid not that Christians will be killed, but that they will kill. Not that Rome will use violence against Christians, but the Christians will use violence against Rome. And that emphasizes the ultimate difference between the peace of Rome and the peace of Christ. And in the reading that follows this video, you will see that Wright endorses this view. It is Paul's equivalent of Jesus' teaching in the Sermon on the Mount on non-retaliation. Instead, turn the other cheek, go the extra mile, and pray for your enemies. Third, the authorities are answerable to God. Romans 13:1 says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that exist have been instituted by God." Wright comments, "In a world where rulers have been accustomed to claim divine honours, the statement that they hold their office as a vocation from the one God constitutes a major demotion. And since this is the first verse of the chapter, it sets the context for the rest of the discussion. The order to be subject or submit is in the context of the state receiving its authority from God. If it usurps that authority, as with Egypt, Assyria and Babylon in the Old Testament, God will overthrow them. But if they rule in a godly way, acknowledging that their authority comes from God, then they are a force for good, and Christians should be supportive. Fourth, do not join tax riots. This is the view of MacDonald, who notes that this is the only specific issue mentioned in the section. His article can be found on Moodle. Having introduced the key principles in Romans 13, 1-5, Paul now turns to the issue at hand. For the same reason, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants, busy with this very thing. Pay to all what is due them, taxes to whom taxes are due, revenue to whom revenue is due, respect to whom respect is due, honour to whom honour is due. Now we don't know that both Tacitus and Suetonius record public protests against extreme taxation. So the temptation for Christians would be to join such protests and thus show support for the downtrodden. But such riots inevitably became violent, and so Paul sees it as an unnecessary provocation and the one that will only call forth violence from Rome and hinder the spread of the gospel. There is an easy parallel with modern protests. Should Christians march alongside them, knowing that it might well end in violence? Will this do more harm than good for the spread of the gospel? Lastly, James Scott has spoken about hidden transcripts, when conquered peoples write to one another. Thus, when Paul says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct but to bad," everyone would know that rulers are a terror to those who do good. Just look at what happened to Jesus. And in recent history, Caligula attempted to halt the Jewish sacrifices and have his statue erected in the temple, and Claudius recently had Jews expelled from Rome. Thus anyone reading this would know immediately that Paul is using a hidden transcript. Of course the state is a terror to those who seek to do good. There are countless examples of it, including Jesus. But Paul does not want to cause trouble for the Christians in Rome if this letter becomes known to the authorities. And so he gives the impression that they have nothing to fear from Christians who are a law-abiding people. It was an argument the apologists made in the 2nd and 3rd centuries to their respective emperors. With this in mind, it is worth revisiting the submissive statements that we looked at in the first video. We all know that Paul tells wives, children and slaves to be submissive. For us in the 21st century, they jump out at us as something against modern egalitarian ideals. But in the 1st century, it would be simply stating the obvious. What would stand out are Paul's comments that follow. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger. And masters, stop threatening your slaves, for you know that both of you have the same master in heaven, and with him there is no partiality. This is what would have stood out to a 1st century reader, and it would have been radical. So some would say that Paul is both conformist and subversive. Others, however, would say that the subversive trumps the conformist, for it is what would have stood out in his 1st century context. So the question we are left with is this: are any of these explanations sufficiently plausible not to allow this passage to mitigate the arguments of Wright, Crossenborg and Neil Elliott that Paul confronted the empire with the gospel of Jesus Christ? They read, 1. The church had no power to change Rome, and so acceptance was the only option while continuing to preach the gospel. 2. Paul relativizes imperial power. It is given by God and can be withdrawn by God, though Christian witness will be hampered by provoking Roman wrath. 3. Paul urges Christians not to join violent movements, even if their aims coincide. 4. Paul urges Christians not to join violent tax protests, as it will hinder the gospel. And 5. Paul's positive statements are an example of a hidden script from and to a subject people. This is Paul's subversion strategy when addressing the capital. And finally, read what Wright has to say on pages 1302 to 1305. And if this has whet your appetite for doing this as an essay question, read Dunn's article on Moodle and any commentaries you can lay your hands on Romans 13.